The first thing they take is your name, not all at once, but in pieces. You go from Eleanor to Mom, then to Grandma, and finally to just a pronoun in a sentence spoken with a sigh of a long-suffering martyr. She needs something again. My daughter-in-law Sabine would mutter, her voice a blade wrapped in silk. Tonight she'd outdone herself. She didn't even grant me the dignity of a pronoun. Old crow, can't you manage a fork? Just use the dog's dish. It all ends up in the same place, doesn't it? Her laughter was a shard of glass in the sterile silence of the kitchen. My son Julian didn't look up from the blue-lit screen of his laptop, his shoulders hunched in a posture of willful ignorance. I had come to know better than his own face. My grandson Leo, a boy of 16, whose cruelty was as casual as his expensive sneakers, snickered and held up his phone, the dark lens of vacant judging eye. He didn't film, not this time, but the threat was its own kind of violence. Sabine dropped the plastic bowl onto the linoleum with a dull, dismissive clatter. It wasn't just a plastic bowl, it was his bowl. Apollo's, their magnificent overfed Rhodesian Ridgeback. I could see the faint ghostly residue of kibble dust clinging to the sides, a powdery film that caught the cold glare of the overhead light. Inside, a congealed lump of day-old mashed potatoes sat beside a sliver of dried-out pork chop and a few anemic-looking peas. Food, she'd said last week when this new ritual began. As if the vessel didn't matter, as if the intent wasn't the whole point. I didn't speak. Silence had become my armor, my fortress, the one place they couldn't touch me. I picked up the bowl, my knuckles white, and carried it to the small splintered stool by the utility sink, my designated dining area. The fork was plastic, a flimsy thing that bent against the cold meat. I ate slowly, methodically, each chew a deliberate act of defiance. They thought this was my surrender. They were wrong. This was me gathering ammunition with every cold, tasteless bite. I let my mind drift away from the fluorescent hum of my son's kitchen in Crestfall, New York, a place where I had become a ghost. I drifted back 4 years to a home that smelled of lavender and old books, to a polished oak table where my husband Arthur would be carving a leg of lamb, his eyes twinkling as he asked if my wine glass needed refilling. We had a small garden where the peonies grew wild and a porch swing where we'd watch summer storms roll in over the hills. We had a life built not on extravagance, but on the sturdy foundation of mutual respect. Then a blood vessel in his brain, no bigger than a thread, decided to snap. One moment he was laughing at a joke on the radio, the next he was just gone. The paramedics were kind. He didn't suffer, Mrs. Vance, one of them had said, his voice soft with practiced sympathy. But I did. I suffered the deafening silence he left behind, a quiet so vast it had its own weight pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. Selling the house felt like amputating a limb. It's for the best. Mom Julian had insisted, his arm a heavy proprietary weight on my shoulder. Sabine had stood beside him, her face a perfect mask of concern, nodding as she calculated the equity. You'll come live with us, we'll take care of everything. I believed them. I let them pack away my life into cardboard boxes labeled Misk, my wedding china, Arthur's collection of first edition histories, the framed photograph of us on our honeymoon. All of it vanished into the cavernous darkness of their attic. At first it was civilized. I had the guest room, a lovely space with a view of the maple tree in the front yard. I was invited to dinner, I helped fold laundry and walk Apollo. I was useful, but usefulness has a shelf life. The change was gradual, a slow poisoning of the atmosphere. It started with small things: Sabine's complaints about the cost of my prescriptions, Julian's habit of speaking about me as if I weren't in the room, Leo's loud theatrical sighs whenever I asked him to turn down his music. The guest room soon filled with their overflowing clutter, and I was moved to a small airless room in the finished part of the basement. It's cozier down here, Sabine had chirped, less noise, better for your rest. The dog bowl was the final frontier. It appeared after I gently mentioned that the cold dinners were upsetting my stomach. Sabine hadn't answered with words. She had simply scraped my plate into Apollo's dish and held it out to me, her eyes daring me to object. I had taken the bowl and eaten just as I was doing now. I finished the last pea, the plastic fork scraping against the bottom of the bowl. I stood, rinsed the dish under a trickle of cold water, and placed it on the floor next to Apollo's water bowl. I walked past my son, who was now scrolling through stock market tickers, and my grandson, who was laughing at something on his phone. Neither of them acknowledged me. I was a piece of furniture that moved on its own. Down in the basement, the air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and furnace oil. My bed was a thin mattress on a metal frame tucked into an alcove behind the water heater. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't need it. I crawled under the threadbare blanket, the thud of their footsteps overhead a constant rhythmic reminder of my displacement. But I didn't sleep. Instead, I reached into my pillowcase and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook and a pen. In the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy casement window, I began to write. November 5th. Served dinner in dog bowl for the 8th time. Sabine called me an old crow. Julian did not react. Leo smirked. Documented. November 6th. Overheard Sabine on the phone with her sister. It's like running an adult daycare that doesn't pay. The SSI barely covers her food, and God knows she eats like a horse. False. My SSI check is deposited directly into their joint account. They raised my rent by $200 last month. November 7th. Tomorrow 9 a.m. Call Silas. Confirm he received the first packet. Instruct him to begin The asset trace Silas Croft had been Arthur's lawyer for 40 years, he was 85 sharp as a tack, and possessed a memory for legal loopholes that was nothing short of encyclopedic. They thought I was a doddering old woman, a relic with a fading mind, who couldn't remember what she had for breakfast, but they had forgotten who I was before Arthur died. I was the one who managed our investments, I was the one who balanced the books, who negotiated contracts for Arthur's small woodworking business, who understood the intricate dance of finance and law. I wasn't just Arthur's wife, I was his partner in every sense of the word. They had also forgotten how they got their start when Julian was 26, drowning in student debt, and married to a woman whose credit card bills were a monument to fiscal irresponsibility. No landlord in the state would give them a lease. Every application was a dead end, but Arthur and I had said yes. We signed the lease on their first apartment, we paid the security deposit, we dipped into our own retirement savings to give them a foundation, a place to start their lives, without the crushing weight of failure. They had cried that day, hugging us, promising a lifetime of gratitude. Gratitude, I had learned, has an expiration date. It soured like milk over the years, as they climbed the social and financial ladder, a ladder whose rungs Arthur and I had held steady for them. With each promotion, each new house, each expensive vacation, the memory of their humble beginnings grew fainter until it was gone completely. Why didn't see me as their benefactor anymore? They saw me as a line item on their budget, a liability, a walking, breathing inconvenience. But what they saw as weakness, I was honing into a weapon. They thought my silence was acceptance. They mistook my compliance for defeat. They had no idea that in the quiet darkness of my basement room, I was building a case against them, brick by meticulous brick. They thought they had taken everything from me. They would soon discover that the most valuable thing I possessed was my memory, and I remembered everything. The cruelty escalated with a chilling, calculated precision. It was never about physical violence. Sabine was too clever for that. There were no bruises to photograph, no broken bones to report. Her methods were far more insidious, designed to dismantle a person from the inside out, leaving no visible trace. It was the art of invisible abuse, and she was a master. One morning I went to the small pantry to get a box of tea and found a new padlock on the door. Sabine was standing there, wiping the counter, her expression one of bland indifference. We're trying to cut down on unnecessary snacking, Eleanor, she said, not looking at me. Portion control is important at your age. She handed me a small insulated lunch bag. Inside was a single tea bag, 2 packets of artificial sweetener, and a dry biscuit, my ration for the day. I simply nodded and said thank you. A week later, the handle on the door to the upstairs bathroom, the only one with a proper bathtub, vanished, replaced by a smooth metal plate. A note taped to the door read, plumber coming, do not use. No plumber ever came. I heard Sabine laughing on the phone that evening. She has a perfectly good toilet in the basement. It's not a spa, honestly. The entitlement. I started taking sponge baths at the utility sink, the cold water chilling me to the bone. Leo, emboldened by his parents' open contempt, sharpened his verbal attacks. He began referring to me as the cellar dweller. He'd walk past me and make a great show of sniffing the air. Ugh, it smells like mothballs and regret in here, he announced one afternoon to a friend he'd brought home. Julian was in the next room, and said nothing. His silence was his signature on every act of cruelty. It was his consent. The final unforgivable straw was not the dog bowl, but what I overheard a few nights after that ritual began. I was making my way upstairs to retrieve a book when I heard Sabine's voice, sharp and venomous, drifting from the kitchen. She was on the phone, likely with her sister again. I'm telling you, it's a drain on our W-2. It's like having a human fungus attached to your finances. You know what they should do? They should let you transfer the Social Security benefits to someone who's actually contributing, not someone whose only job is to breathe our air and wait to die. I froze in the hallway, my hand gripping the banister so tightly my knuckles ached. I could hear the faint clink of Julian's coffee mug against the granite countertop. He was there, he was listening, and he was silent. That was the moment something inside me finally broke, not my spirit, but my patience. I retreated to the basement, my heart a cold heavy stone in my chest. I opened my notebook. My handwriting was steady, clinical. I was no longer just a victim, I was a plaintiff gathering evidence for a trial. Only I knew was coming. November 15th, padlock on pantry, rationed, 1 tea bag, bathroom door handle removed under false pretense of a leak. November 17th, Leo called me the cellar dweller in front of Julian. No response. November 19th, overheard Sabine refer to me as a human fungus and a drain on the W-2. Julian was present and complicit in his silence. I did not weep. Tears were a luxury I could not afford. Instead, a cold crystalline rage began to form within me. They had mistaken my grief for senility and my kindness for weakness. They had walled me in brick by brick, hoping I would simply fade away, but they had forgotten I was the daughter of a stone mason. I knew how to find the cracks in any foundation, and theirs was built on a bedrock of lies. The following morning the house was empty. Julian was at work, Leo at school, and Sabine was at her weekly yoga class. I had a 90-minute window. It was more than enough. I went to the back of my basement alcove and pulled out a dusty shoebox filled with the artifacts of my former life, old tax returns, dividend statements, and the faint spidery handwriting of my husband in the margins of financial reports tucked inside an Envelope was the business card I was looking for. Silas Croft, ESQ attorney at law. My hand was steady as I dialed the number. A gravely voice answered on the second ring. Croft. Silas, it's Eleanor Vance. There was a brief pause. Eleanor, it's been too long. Is everything all right? His voice was sharp, cutting through the years of silence. He wasn't one for pleasantries. No, Silas, I said, my voice low, and even nothing is all right. I told him everything. I spoke without emotion, listing the events as I had in my notebook: the isolation, the financial control, the verbal abuse, the dog bowl. He listened without interruption, the silence on his end of the line, not one of judgment, but of absorption. He was a man who understood that the most damning testimony is often delivered in the calmest voice. They think I've lost my mind, Silas, I finished. They think I don't remember the Vanguard account this time. The silence was shorter. Ah, he said, a world of understanding in that single syllable. The rainy day fund Arthur set up in '99, the one you both signed as co-owners with you holding a 40% stake, the very one I confirmed. I'd like you to look into it quietly, consider it done. He said, don't do anything, Eleanor, just keep your eyes open and keep writing. 3 days later he called back. His voice was grim. Eleanor, they've been drawing from it for 2 years. Julian filed a form listing himself as your primary caregiver and claiming you were mentally incapable of managing your own finances. He alleged you gave verbal consent to transfer control of all your assets for household management purposes. He paused, letting the words sink in. Its fraud, Eleanor, plain and simple federal-level fraud. I've seen this script 100 times. They call it helping until they're the sole beneficiary on your life insurance. A wave of nausea washed over me, but my voice remained firm. What do you need me to do? I need you to become a spy in your own home, he said. Document everything. Photographs, if you can, recordings. We need more than your word. We need irrefutable proof. The next day my mission began. I used my small antiquated cell phone to take a picture of the plastic dog bowl sitting next to a pristine porcelain plate. I photographed the padlock on the pantry. I began carrying a tiny digital voice recorder, a gift from Arthur years ago for his bird watching, in my pocket. I caught Sabine telling Leo, if she complains about the cold one more time, I swear I'm going to start charging her for the electricity to use the microwave. I recorded Leo bragging to a friend on a video call. It's like having a live-in tax credit that smells like old people. Every night I would upload the files to a secure online drive Silas had created for me. I played my part perfectly. I was the frail, forgetful old woman. I smiled, vacantly nodded when spoken to, and ate whatever was put in front of me without complaint. I shuffled when I walked. I let my sentences trail off behind the mask of senility. My mind was a whirring engine of calculation, lining updates, documents, and damning declarations. They thought Hey, we're caging an animal. They had no idea they were forging a sword. The opportunity one was waiting for arrived on a crisp Tuesday afternoon in early December. The house was blessedly silent. Sabine had taken Leo to a regional debate tournament an hour away. Julian was at a mandatory all-day conference in the city. I had the entire house to myself until evening. It was time to set the final pieces in motion. I walked upstairs, my notebook in hand, and went directly to the landline phone mounted on the kitchen wall, a relic they never used and therefore never monitored. I found the number I needed written on the back of an old recipe card for Arthur's favorite apple crumble. I dialed. A professional, brisk voice answered. Albright Property Management. This is Cheryl. Cheryl, my name is Eleanor Vance, I said, my voice clear and strong. I'm calling about the property at 14 Willow Lane in Crest Fall. I believe you are the owner. There was a brief silence on the line. I knew she was scanning her files. Her memory. I was the original co-signer on my son's first lease with your company 12 years ago. The recognition dawned in her voice. Mrs. Vance, of course, I remember you and your husband, such lovely people. You're still living there with Julian and his family, aren't you? I looked at the scuffed plastic bowl sitting by the sink. I am, I said quietly, but I feel it is my duty to inform you of the conditions of my tenancy and that of your other undeclared tenant. That got her attention. I'm sorry, she said, her voice sharpening. Did you say other tenant? I let the story unfold, every detail delivered with precision. The padlocked pantry, the inaccessible bathroom, the basement room where I slept beside a furnace, and then the checkmate. Yes, for the past 8 months my daughter-in-law has been subletting the other finished room in the basement to a university student, a young woman named Clara. The rent is paid in cash directly to Sabine. I'm quite certain there is no formal sublease agreement and that this income has not been reported to you. The explosion on the other end of the line was immensely satisfying. I will tear that lease to shreds. Miss Albright hissed. My contract explicitly forbids subletting. They have violated the terms in the most flagrant way possible. The student believes it to be a legitimate arrangement, I added calmly. Sabine has collected approximately $4,000 from her so far, tax-free, of course. Mrs. Vance, she said, her voice now dangerously low, you have just given me everything I need to begin eviction proceedings. I am calling my legal team this afternoon. Thank you for your honesty. You're welcome, I said, and hung up the phone. It had taken less than 5 minutes to light the fuse. My next call was to Silas. I gave him the update. It's time, Eleanor, he said, his voice imbued with a grim satisfaction. He didn't need to elaborate. That evening I slipped a small flash drive containing copies of all my evidence, photos, audio files, bank statements into a padded envelope. I addressed it to The New York State Office for the Aging Elder Protective Services Division 1 walked to the post office and paid extra for certified mail with a tracking number. The game was afoot. 3 days later, Mr. Albright arrived at the front door, accompanied by a uniformed county sheriff. I watched the confrontation from the basement window. I saw the color drain from Sabine's face. As she was handed an official-looking document, I saw Julian rush out. His face a mask of panicked disbelief. They were served with a notice of lease termination for material breach of contract. They had 72 hours to formally respond. The following morning, 2 neatly dressed individuals, a man and a woman, knocked on the door. They weren't from the sheriff's department. They flashed badges and identified themselves as investigators from the state's Adult Protective Services and the Social Security Administration's Fraud Division. Were here regarding an inquiry into financial exploitation and benefits fraud, the woman said, her eyes sweeping past a stammering Sabine to scan the interior of the house. I chose that moment to make my entrance. I ascended the basement stairs, slowly, deliberately, no longer playing the part of the shuffling invalid. I stood at the top of the stairs, my hand resting on the railing, and met my son's terrified gaze. The mask was off. The invisible woman was finally being seen. Sabine began to weep hysterically. Julian pleaded, talking of misunderstandings and clerical errors. Leo, appearing in the hallway, pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed, "This is all your fault. You ruined everything." I didn't flinch. I simply watched the life they had built on my silent suffering crumble into dust. Later that day, I received a call from a caseworker named Maria. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "we have completed our preliminary review. You are officially documented as a victim of financial and emotional elder abuse. We are initiating protective services immediately. We will help you with housing, asset recovery, and anything else you need." I closed my eyes and breathed in the musty basement air for the last time. It wasn't the smell of defeat anymore, it was the smell of freedom. They used to say I was too fragile to live on my own, too confused, too far gone. But here I stood in the sun-drenched kitchen of my own quiet apartment, overlooking a snow-covered park. After the eviction and during the ongoing federal investigation into their finances, the state had placed me in a beautiful senior living community. Silas had worked his magic, untangling the web of deceit Julian had woven around my accounts. The Vanguard Fund, the money I was told was long gone, was restored to me. It had never been gone, it had simply been stolen. I didn't stop at survival. That would have been their victory. I decided to build with a portion of my recovered funds. I opened a small bakery and tea room in the heart of Crestfall. I called it the Hearth, not for the oven, but for the idea of a central warming place in a home. On the wall I hung a simple hand-carved wooden sign, "No one eats in the dark here." The hearth became a sanctuary for the invisible, the widows who were tired of eating alone, the overlooked mothers whose children were too busy for them, the women who, like me, had been silenced and made small. Every Wednesday we hosted a gathering called Speak Your Truth. There were no microphones, just a long communal table, endless pots of tea, and a simple question written on a chalkboard: what is a story only you can tell? Clara, the student who had unknowingly rented a room in my prison, became my first employee and my dearest friend. She was studying to be a social worker, her path now irrevocably shaped by what she had witnessed. She listened to the stories told at the hearth with a compassion that was both fierce and gentle. She was learning what silence costs and what listening can restore. One afternoon a year after the hearth opened, the bell above the door chimed. A young man stood there, thin and hesitant, his eyes shadowed with a pain I recognized. It was Leo. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply said, "I didn't know, and I'm sorry. I didn't want to know." He told me he'd left home, was in therapy, and was trying to understand the man he was becoming. I poured him a cup of tea. He now volunteers on weekends washing dishes and listening. He is learning to be better. I never saw Julian or Sabine again. I heard they moved out of state, their careers in ruins, their reputations tarnished by the fraud investigation. I didn't seek out the details.
Their story was over, mine was just beginning. My legacy isn't the money they tried to steal, or the house I lost. It's here in the smell of baking bread and the low hum of conversation. It's in the eyes of a woman who finally tells her story and is believed. It's the quiet, unshakable knowledge that my value was never theirs to determine. They tried to bury me, but they didn't realize I was a seed. They thought my silence was the end, but it was just the beginning. It wasn't surrender, it was strategy. And when the world tries to erase you, you don't fight back by becoming like them. You remind them who you are by rebuilding, by reclaiming, and by blooming in the very places they tried to pave over. You teach them that wisdom doesn't shout, it remembers.